Remember a while ago when I said that the next tournament Tactician was going to be a big one because it was going to be leading into the Team Liquid Ascent of Targon Invitational Open Qualifier? That's this one. So we're not going to waste any time on an intro. We're going to get right into it. We're going to be talking about that qualifier, 3-deck, region locked, 1 ban, you know the format, conquest, all that. Let's talk about it. So as usual, I'm going to bring you over to my tournament tier list. As you can see, there's been a lot of expansion from the last week. Most notably, a couple of decks have dropped out of tier 1. We've introduced some decks that we've been seeing a lot more of, such as War Mother's Control, Zombie Ash, the new Lee Sin Noxus deck, well, sort of the old Lee Sin Noxus deck, Harrowing Elites, the Dragon deck, and then down in tier 3, we also added some things. Some Frostbite Allegiance decks have been popping up. We moved Karma Ezreal, and pretty much every other iteration of Ezreal pretty far down the ladder. Twisted Fate Ezreal, really the only one that we kept in tier 2, and that's seems to be more wishful thinking than anything. And then down in Unplaced, we actually have Lulu decks, Heimerdinger decks, and things like Trundle Ladros, because Trundle Ladros, while it was fairly popular for a little bit there, seems to have just been adapted into the War Mother's Control deck. There are some versions of this that are still running the Revitalizing Roar for that Ladros Atrocity combo. Pretty much all War Mothers are Tryndamere Trundle at this point, so that just kind of is, you know, how that went. Now, I'm still only going to go through the newer decks. I thought about going through every deck just in case there are newer players who are watching who sought this out for the new Invitational, but since I have the archetypes sort of listed out next to it as well as the regional composition, I have faith that you can kind of look at the deck list yourself and figure out the general strategy, because as always, this tier list will be linked in the description below. So for the more experienced players who have been watching Tournament Tactician for a long time, let me show you what War Mother's Control looks like. Were you expecting something super cool and special? No, it's War Mother's Call. They typically have really cut down on the unit count, and they really just want to hit their high-impact units. We see a return of Warding Stone and Catalyst of Aeons. It feels like ever since Ramp Soul came into the meta, everybody kind of remembered how good Ramp is and how powerful that is, as well as Trundle just being a great addition to the deck. But generally what they're doing is they're stalling out into the late game, and then they're killing you with overwhelm units like Trundle, Tryndamere, Ladros halving your life total. We see the atrocities in there to help them get over the top, and of course they won over Revitalizing Roar that I had mentioned. This one's not super standard, but people are playing it. We've also seen a couple copies of Ruination come out. Personally, I'm a big fan of the Icequake, just because if you are playing against an aggressive deck and you skip turns 1 and 2 and then you Warding Stone on 3, you can Icequake on 4, and that'll kill just about any aggro board that is set up by that point. The next deck I wanted to talk about was Zombie Ash. We don't actually see this deck a whole lot, but every time someone talks to me about tournaments, I tell them that there are like 5 or 6 really good Freljord Shadow Isle decks, and this is one of them that I bring up a lot, and this is sort of my go-to explanation of what a tournament deck looks like. This is not something I would recommend playing on ladder, but in a very specific tournament meta where you know what you're going to be playing against, this can really hit some of those matchups and have a good spread into what you expect the tournament meta to look like, not necessarily the laddered format. Which unfortunately does mean that it's hard to get practice on this deck. If you don't have a scrim partner, you could get really discouraged by constantly trying to play this on ladder. It's not a bad ladder deck per se, but it's definitely something that can be a little bit awkward in the learning stages. You'll lose a lot of LP while you try to figure out how the deck functions, and generally the strategy is to have a bunch of ashes die, harrowing them back, and then your opponent can't block anything because you have so many ashes, frostbiting every unit your opponent has. They'll all level, you have a good time. The one thing that I really like about the deck is Rhymefang Wolf. As we see more ramp decks come out, this is the best answer to a Wording Stone on turn 3. And generally, if your opponent does play the Wording Stone on 3, and then you can respond with the Rhymefang Wolf, similarly to how do we constantly see deep players float turn 3 to see if a Wording Stone comes down and they can play a Jaw Hunters in response, this one doesn't get stopped by Troll Chant, because it will put the Rhymefang down to 1 HP. Their Wording Stone will be a 0/6. Rhymefang only has to deal 1 damage to kill any unit with 0 attack. So you still get that full value out of something like this. And we saw a couple of Frostbite Allegiance decks that started popping up that also play Rhymefang Wolf. Those are down in tier 3. I don't know if they have any traction, but I just wanted to kind of highlight this as like the best Rhymefang Wolf deck. If you are constantly finding yourself in those situations against ramp decks where you're like, wow, really wish I had a deck that could do that, you might want to look into this one. So with the release of patch 1.10 a couple days ago, the major players were Flash of Brilliance bringing Heimerdinger back into the forefront of people's minds, and Lee Sin received a minor rework where he got a cost reduction and an increase in the number of spells needed to level him. Since then, ladder players have been non-stop testing out these two champions. I haven't seen anything that stands out to me as particularly powerful or consistent, and it matters even more in a tournament setting where you do have a regional composition that sort of locks you out of other decks. For example, if you found a really good Freljord Lee Sin deck, all of a sudden Freljord Shadow Isle is off the table for you, and as I just mentioned, there's a lot of good Freljord Shadow Isle decks. Noxus is something that's really only contested between Swain Twisted Fate and something like Pirate Aggro. If you're not playing either of those, I'm actually struggling to think of like a very good Noxus deck that comes to my mind, RIP Frostbite Midrange. So I do think that if this is a style that you want to go for, Kick Axe is probably the way to go, which they call it because, Draven has axes, but generally this is just a Lee Sin combo deck that's looking to give the Lee Sin overwhelm and one-shot your opponent, or even kick through their unit and just completely one-shot them with that. You have Captain Farron for some top end. Some people have been playing Horns of the Dragon so that you have another good target for your overwhelm cards. And since I'm not going to talk about Heimerdinger, I kind of want to highlight it here. I highly expect Ionia and Piltover Zon to be two of the least represented regions. We really weren't seeing Piltover and Zon outside of Ezreal. We saw a couple of discard aggro decks, but for the most part, it was either Ezreal, discard aggro, or you weren't playing Piltover and Zon. Similarly, Ionia, you were either playing Karma Ezreal, or you just really weren't playing Ionia. And I think with the way that things have shaped up with how little testing we've had going into this open qualifier, I fully expect Ionia and Piltover Zon to still be the least represented regions across Top Cut. This is definitely a weekend for players to try hard and get their invite into that $2,000 invitational. So while we would normally probably see some top players see if they could take a Lee Sin deck through Top Cut, I think it's going to matter a little bit more to them to get invited to this Ascent of Targon event. And mostly what that means is, one, you don't have to expect a lot of Lee Sin or Heimerdinger, I would assume, and two, if you do think you have found a very good Heimer or Lee Sin deck, it should actually slot into your lineup fairly easily. I'd also mentioned a return of Harrowing Elites. This is basically just Harrowing Bannerman, but with the War Chef nerf. I think that this is a direction people will go with the return to Battlesmith, and we see cards like For the Fallen. It's important that you understand what this card does, so I'm just going to read it out loud so there's no confusion. When you summon an elite, reduce my cost by 1. That only works if For the Fallen is in your hand. And then for each ally that died this round, summon a Dauntless Vanguard. What that means is that it is very possible for you to go for some kind of combo like, oh, let me Harrowing for 9 mana, and then my For the Fallen is reduced cost because I summoned a bunch of elites, because I got Vanguard Squires and Vanguard Bannermans and Garen and things like that. And then all of my units die because I attacked with the Harrowing. Oh, let me rebuild my board with For the Fallen. And overall, just with the reduction of Piltover and Zon, there's not as much Mystic Shot or even really 2 damage removal in the meta. I know that we always talk about 2 health is really easy to kill, but it's usually just Death's Hand and Mystic Shot that are actually doing that. For the most part, everything else is going to be 1 or 3, and those 2 are really the only ones that hit that sweet spot. So, as I had mentioned earlier, I don't think Piltover and Zon is going to be heavily played this weekend. Battlesmith does stick around a lot more than you might expect him to. And he only has to buff up 1 or 2 units to get sort of full value. And of course, you still have Sith-3 of Cloudfield. Not seeing Fleet Feather Tracker feels a little bit weird here, but this is sort of a different style of Bannerman. This is sort of what Bannerman came from and evolved out of for those history fanatics out there, even though it was only like 6 months ago. But essentially, you're just playing every card in the game that has the Elite tag. Sometimes, I don't know if this is necessarily the best way to do it. I think that I would like to see some other cards like Genevieve Elmhart, maybe even some challengers, but, we'll see how it goes. Overall, I just wanted to make you aware that this is something that exists, and if you are a diehard Bannerman fan, but really can't find yourself where you want to find your footing for Bannerman after the War Chef nerf, maybe take a look in this direction. And lastly, I don't want to get into the tier 3 decks, so I'm just going to show you tier 1 and tier 2, and this is the last tier 2 deck that I have lined out, is the Dragon deck. You may have heard of this, you may have seen it, you may have lost to it on ladder, you may have never had a problem with it. It's a pretty polarizing deck, it's pretty high roll, as you can tell by the mobilizes in the list. They're really just trying to reduce the cost of their dragons and then play a bunch of dragons. It can be really awkward to play against because you want to play the pass game back and forth with your opponent and say, oh, you're not aggroing me out in the early game, that's great, I can go ahead and turn my late game strategy online by just passing back and forth with you. But what they're doing is they're building up their hand for a more valuable mobilize. And it can be difficult to deal with some of these cards like Fused Firebrand and Involius Vox, as I had mentioned. Anytime that your unit is above 4 or 5 HP, you generally have to string together multiple removal spells to get rid of it, and something like Fused Firebrand having Spell Shield going to be especially hard to get rid of. And even we see Radiant Guardian because it's just another unit that's difficult to remove. Radiant Guardian is probably going to be one of the most prominent cards on the weekend. I definitely think that Lux Asol is going to be like the most popular deck, which makes it weird to show you this other Demacia Targon deck. This might even need to be tier 3 for tournament purposes, just because I am hard-pressed to imagine anybody wanting to bring this over Lux Asol, but maybe this is just your more your style of deck, and that's fine. You should play to your strengths when you're going into a tournament. Don't focus on other people's tier lists so much. Play your comfort decks. If this is the Demacia Targon deck that you have the most practice on, you're not a big fan of Lux or anything like that, go ahead and bring it. You'll probably find a fair amount of success with it. But I did want to highlight that this is kind of what it looks like. They're just playing everything that is called a dragon. They're playing Mobilize and Herald of the Dragons. It's a pretty straightforward, pretty honest deck. Not a whole lot of combat tricks in here. You know, they do have ways to heal up their units. I've seen some even playing Guiding Touch just so that they have that smaller heal to keep a Screeching Dragon alive and around for longer. And that's kind of what they're doing, is just playing one guy. They're not really pillaring on it because they're just shitting out multiple big guys. So it can be difficult to deal with if you're not playing something like a Ruination. But generally, you're not seeing Bastion in a list like this. So it really is just the Spell Shield with a Fused Firebrand and Aurelion Soul that you have to worry about getting through. And it can be really hard to control their board for the Aurelion Soul to come down and try and play around their level up. But I'm sure that you'll figure something out. As I said, this isn't the best Targon Demacia deck. So if you're struggling with this, I pray that you have some hidden strategy for Lux Aesol. And then there are just some sort of footnotes on the tier list that I wanted to talk about. So if you've watched this before, you may have seen it. I haven't said it in a while, but tier 1 is sort of what I consider to be the best decks in the format. If you can build a lineup out of tier 1 decks, that is probably going to be the quote-unquote standard lineup, which for this week I would sort of assume to be Twisted Fate Swain, Lux Aurelion Soul, and War Mother's Control. As I had mentioned, Piltover and Zon getting left to the wayside there. Scouts, I still kept in tier 1, but that's because I really haven't seen a lot of evidence regarding the War Chef nerf. I don't actually know how Scout players feel about it. Maybe it's fine, maybe it was just a little quality of life nerf, maybe it did completely kill the deck. I don't actually know. I haven't seen anyone play Scouts in tournaments since then. And I mean, there haven't really been a lot of tournaments since the patch, since it was a couple days ago, so I just kind of left it in tier 1 to cover my ass. I'd honestly move it down to tier 1.5 if I could, but I don't like having tier 1.5 stuff like that, and I definitely didn't want to put it in unplaced or undecided, so we'll just keep it there for now. But I do think that Lux Aesol is far and away the best Demacia deck. I've been having a lot of fun and success with it on ladder. I know a lot of players have been having success with it in tournament. Overall, it's the kind of deck that I like to play, so I am skewed in this one, but I do think you're going to continue to see this. War Mother's Control, from what I hear, sort of popped up as an answer to the Lux Aesol. It can out late game it, you know, just continue to go wide. Oh, your lasers don't actually kill anything on my board. Your Concerted Strikes don't get a whole lot of value when I'm running something like Harsh Winds. It can be difficult for Demacia to pair into a deck like that. And then, of course, Twisted Fate Swain or Pirate Aggro, if that is the line that you want to go, is just one of the most consistent decks in the format. Twisted Fate Swain had a really poor showing this week in tournaments, but I don't necessarily know that that's the deck's fault or that it doesn't pair well into the meta. I think it might have just been kind of a flash in the plan, bad event for the deck. You know, maybe the players weren't playing it super optimally. Could be a number of things, but Pirate Aggro seems to be considered to be on the same power level as the Twisted Fate Swain, so if you do want to bring that instead, totally understand. Maybe you're even just bored of Twisted Fate Swain and need something a little bit new. You don't want to sort of autopilot every time you pick up a deck, so if you are bored of it, there is merit to putting it down for no other reason than you don't want to autopilot through your games. You should try and pay attention while you can, drink some water, you know, really get your tournament wits about you, but I can understand if that's something that you're concerned about. I'm actually not going to jump into the Runeterra client to show you the deck list because I feel like I can do it here. So just because, you know, time constraints and things like that. So as I had said, Twisted Fate Swain, Lux Aesol, War Mother's Control. Maybe we play Pirate Aggro instead of Twisted Fate Swain. This is sort of your standard lineup for the weekend. This is what you should be looking to beat. You know, it's possible that Indoor Spiders replaces the War Mother's Control as well. So it is a little bit strange because you have, you know, this Lux Aesol deck is almost guaranteed to be the most popular Demacia deck, but then even if you're looking at the same regional compositions around it and going for a Noxus Bilgewater deck and a Shadow Isle Failure deck, you have options on what you want to run. And that's kind of where the Zombie Ash deck comes in. It usually pairs very well into Indoor Spiders. I would imagine it even has a pretty good chance against the Lux Aesol because you're frostbiting your opponent's entire board. Judgment is something that we've seen the Lux Aesol decks play in the past. It doesn't pair super well into the Zombie Ash. It will struggle with aggro. It can beat Twisted Fate Swain, but I do think that this is kind of a deck that people might have overlooked or you took it off your radar. I would entice you to put it back onto your radar for those last-minute testings. And then, of course, there are people that want to play aggro lineups. You know, maybe we go something like Scouts, we go Indoor Spiders, and we go for, let's say, Discard Aggro. This is sort of the standard aggro lineup that we've seen in the past. Pirate Aggro can come out and replace the Discard Aggro. It really depends on how you feel. Remember, this is a region-locked format as opposed to a unified one. In unified, it is possible to play both Discard and Pirate because there is no overlap on the Noxus between those two decks. Generally, players were cutting Scouts when that happened. So just keep in mind you do have to pick between these two this weekend. I think Pirate Aggro is actually probably going to be the more popular one. So if you're looking to play against aggro decks and sort of wonder what that's going to look like, you probably want to start here. It is possible possible that Lulu is going to replace the Scout deck, but as I had mentioned, not a lot of information on the Lulu deck coming from tournaments. I had heard a lot of hype around the deck while Lulu was banned, but ever since she got unbanned, I still haven't really seen any showings from her, and I put Lulu X because there does seem to be a divide on Lulu Shen versus Lulu Zed. Both decks are aggressive, both decks are mid-rangey, and I think the War Chef nerf makes it feel a little bit worse since you're almost always going to be Ionia Demacia. We really don't see a lot of Lulu Taric or anything like that. And if you are Lulu Demacia, one of your biggest supporters did just get nerfed. That does feel pretty bad. I would understand moving away from the deck, but I do think it's going to be, Pirate Aggro, Indoor Spiders, and some kind of Demacia board-centric deck. It might even be the Harrowing Bannerman that I had mentioned, the Harrowing Elite deck, because there's there's an overlap on Shadow Isle there. So, you see what I'm talking about? We're already getting into some overlaps that I had missed, so Harrowing Elites can't come out on that one, but the Bannerman, as you saw, I mean, there's only one Harrowing in this list, so it is possible for them to run something else and just play an Elite deck. It could even just be Mono Demacia, So keep in mind, if they are playing Pirate Aggro and Indoor Spiders, they can go ahead and play Elites. This is really a deck where you can splash any other region and feel fine about it. As we saw, there was only one Shadow Isle card in this deck, so they could, splash an Ionia just to either play Deny, or maybe they even just play Lulu, go like Lulu Garen, maybe they play Fiora Garen, maybe they play some Unyielding Spirits. I don't know, maybe they branch out into Piltover and Zon and play Vi. That's something we've seen in the past that could really catch you off guard, or any kind of board-centric deck that you want to play. Just keep in mind that Pirate Aggro and Indoor Spiders are almost certainly going to be popping up in those lineups, and then the last one almost certainly going to be some kind of Demacia deck. I wanted to show you a second most popular lineup, but honestly the War Chef nerf is kind of leaving a big question mark over my head lineup-wise. I think that leaving out Demacia is not going to be a popular decision, which means that Lux Aesol should just fit into about every lineup, which really takes Targon off the table for players that wanted to play something like Ramsol. Deep, I still think, is going to be a fairly popular sleeper deck. I think that this is going to pop up in probably the second most amount of lineups, and I would assume it's going to be something like Lux Aesol and Deep. And then this is where the questions pop up, because your leftover regions are Freljord and Noxus alongside Ionia, Piltover, Zon. So maybe those are the kind of lineups where we see something like the Kickaxe come out, or if someone has a Heimerdinger deck or a Lee Sin deck, it'll probably be paired with Lux Aesol and Deep, because I don't think Bilgewater, TF, or Bilgewater and Heimerdinger is something that we're seeing. I know that like Fizz, Lee Sin have synergies, but we never really saw that one take off. But, as always, take a look at this tier list and understand that your opponent could build any lineup out of here. I recommend that if you are looking to just build a lineup and you're looking for help on it, start at tier 1, figure out how many of these decks you enjoy playing, and then kind of go into tier 2. Or if, there's a tier 2 deck that you one-trick, for example, you only ever play, let's say, Dragons on Ladder, and you're just a Dragon player, and that's just what you do. Go ahead and pick up Dragons, and then kind of go down and look at what else fits into my lineup that I'm comfortable playing. If you are just like a diehard Dragon player, then I'd definitely go for Twisted Fate, Swain, and Indoor Spiders, as those are sort of the same general strategies. I know Indoor Spiders listed as aggro combo, but it functions like a mid-range deck as well, so you can kind of slide that one in there, and you're generally playing the same kind of strategy. I know this probably wasn't as in-depth as you were hoping for, at least visually, but the information is there. And as I had mentioned before, we're at that point where the format has expanded sort of beyond control. There's no way that I could sit here and tell you what the most popular and second most popular and third most popular lineup. All I can do is make you aware of the decks that will be out there, tell you what I think will be the most popular based on tournament data, and then what you should be doing to combat that. Now, something that I haven't done in a while is told you what I would run if I were playing in a tournament this weekend. And while I haven't been super impressed by Twisted Fate Swain lately, I think I might sort of begrudgingly bring it. I definitely would bring Lux Aesol. I definitely would bring War Mother's Control. And I would love to not bring Twisted Fate Swain, but honestly, I'm struggling to find an Ionia or Piltover and Zon deck that really appeals to me. There's a non-zero chance that I would end up bringing Twisted Fate Ezreal. I do think that it still pairs into the tournament format pretty well. So if you're wondering what would Boulevard do this weekend, because he's a ballsy man, he would probably bring Lux Aesol, War Mother's Control, and Twisted Fate Ezreal. And that's just because I've always been a big fan of Ezreal. I feel like it has been an underrepresented tournament archetype. I feel like players really want to move away from this as soon as possible and will find any opportunity to do so. Maybe I would even play Karma Ezreal. I think that that deck still is sort of fine. Granted, Karma Ezreal, we would often see the game end as soon as Ezreal hit that 8 level up condition, and the games were generally pretty close. Like Ezreal hit 8 and then immediately needed to come down and win the game. Twisted Fate Ezreal is the one deck that gets around that because the Riptide Rex will go ahead and generally throw out 7 targets. Doesn't always work like that because sometimes you do kill all the units and then you only get off 4 or 5, which is going to matter a lot more now, so we'll see how that goes. Riptide Rex still one of the strongest cards in the game. That's why Nab is still up at tier 2. But yeah, I think that if you were to ask me what I was bringing this weekend, I'd probably lock this in. So that's going to do it for me this week. As always, the tournament tier list will be in the description below, as well as my other socials, and a sign-up link to that Ascent of Targon qualifier. Go ahead and sign up for that one. Registration is closing pretty soon. You're going to need to lock in your decks either tonight or early tomorrow morning, so get in that last-minute testing. Don't stay up all night doing it, because sleep is important. I will be casting all weekend over at twitch.tv/shitjustworks for the NA portion of this tournament, and I believe Caster Gems will be casting the EU side. It's over at twitch.tv/castergems. We'll be casting with Sparkling Iced Tea. So if you have a favorite caster, and it should be me at this point, I can't believe you would like another caster. That's absolutely absurd. How could you do this to me? I thought what we had was special, but I guess not. But yeah, as always, guys, my name is Boulevard. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, good luck in your tournaments.